Välkommen till Stigfinnare. Det handlar om ledarskap inifrån och ut i en föränderlig värld med mig, Carl Lindeborg. Idag är jag jätteglad. Jag har fått möjligheten att tala med David Rooke. David, han bor i England. Han har spenderat större delen av sitt yrkesverksamma liv med att hjälpa organisationer utvecklas och växa och människorna i de organisationerna. Han grundade 1985 ett bolag som heter Harthill Consulting. Och Harthill jobbar globalt med stora organisationer, framförallt med ledarutveckling. Och har ett speciellt fokus på att hjälpa till och möjliggöra transformation. David har en väldigt djup kunskap. Jag tycker att han är en otroligt inspirerande person. Och han delar med sig en del av den här kunskapen dels i en bok som heter Personal and Organizational Transformations och i en klassisk Harvard Business Review-artikel med titeln 7 Transformations of Leadership som han har medförfattat. Och just den artikeln kom också med på Harvard Business Reviews lista över de 10 viktigaste artiklarna skrivna om ledarskap, vilket är fantastiskt. I dagens samtal så pratar jag och David om dels om hur kontexten för ledarskap förändras, arenan för vad det innebär att vara människa och ledare förändras. Allting går snabbare, mycket blir mer komplext och vi måste utveckla oss i kapp det för att kunna vara relevanta, effektfulla och hållbara. Vi cirklar mycket kring någonting som kallas för vertikal utveckling. Som handlar om de här utvecklingsstegen vi har potential att vandra igenom som vuxna. Och hur det blir allt viktigare att vi är mer aktiva i vår egen utveckling. Och just det här med vertikal utveckling, som ni kommer få reda på vad det betyder i mer detalj i podden såklart, är bland det kraftfullaste och mest insiktsfulla verktyg jag har stött på. Jag har otroligt mycket nytta av det själv. Både personligen och i mitt jobb. Så jag hoppas att du kommer också få med dig lärdomar som du har nytta av i ditt liv, där du är. Innan vi kör igång, som vanligt så vill jag säga det att podden är ju inte reklamfinansierad utan möjliggörs av våra verksamheter. Så gå jättegärna in på lindeborgs.com som är vår retreat och vår gårdsverksamhet och leaderevolve.org där vi lägger upp all information om våra utvecklingsprogram. Och längst ner på de här hemsidorna kan man också följa vårt nyhetsbrev och säkerställa att du får de senaste nyheterna. Följ mig gärna på Instagram, min nya Instagram Carl Lindeborg, och jätteglad om du prenumererar på podden om du tycker den är bra. Sista medskick, i det här samtalet så pratar David om möjligheten att göra en personlig profil på sig själv för att förstå mer var är jag just nu i min utveckling. Och den kan man antingen göra genom att kontakta Harthill direkt eller så kan man kontakta oss på Leader Vi har också möjlighet att hjälpa till med det. Så med det sagt så är det nu dags för samtalet med David. David Rooke, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
It's great to have you and great to see you. Today we are obviously doing this over Zoom for obvious reasons, but I think it was about 18 months, you were actually in this room where we're recording right now, and you were here running a workshop for some clients to lead or evolve the community on something that we're going to talk about today that I think is really bridging the future of leadership. And that was a great experience. And we also had time to hang out a little bit and we took a walk in the forest. Yeah. And so it's good to have you back, but in the virtual form. And I must say, David, before I say anything else, I think the topic of today that we're going to talk about is something that I encountered through a program you gave in the UK 3-4 years ago. And I must say that it's been one of the most sort of powerful and enlightening, how should I put it, frames, models, theories that I've encountered. And I think I use it every day almost. It helps me understand myself better, and it helps me understand other people better, and it helps me become more effective. So I'm really excited about this conversation, and I hope we can share some of these things with the community of listeners.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for inviting me to join you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And let's just start with some just background from where you're coming. You founded a consultancy company called Harthill in 1985.
Yes,
So you're still active there. And could you share a little bit about the kind of work you do and how you support your clients?
Yeah, well, Harthill's been a leadership consultancy since its kind of inception, although, of course, like all organizations, it's evolved. And I just say I'm really excited about this phase of its evolution, because I've moved from being the CEO of the organization. I've stepped aside, and there's a new leadership team in place, and they're doing some fantastic work and have remodeled the organization as an ecosystem, which I think fits beautifully with what's emerging in wider society. So Harthill's passionately interested in leadership. Perhaps we'll go on to talk a bit about this, but there's never been a time when I think how we lead, and of course we're all leaders, this isn't some rarefied thing, this is a thing each one of us can do in our families, in our communities, and in our organizations. How we lead in these unbelievably challenging and interesting times is of massive importance. So for me, the work that Harthill does is of real significance.
Yeah.
We largely work in bigger organizations. So we've worked with some of the leading corporates around the world. We've worked in the governmental space, and I think that's it's been a privilege to do that work. And we're also delighted to be able to kind of influence the way people think about themselves and their organizations. So that's been the work, that continues to be the work, with a focus on leadership and leadership systems.
Right. And if we bring it even further back, how did you get into these kind of topics around leadership systems, cultures in the first place?
Well, as so many people respond to that question, as a complete accident. Way back when I was a young man, I decided that I was going to become a teacher. My closest friends said, "Don't do it. It's not for you." And I said, "Nah, I think it is. I think it will be fine." So I did a year of teacher training. I went and worked in a state school in the UK. And at the end of it, I knew I loved the process of educating, but I knew that teaching wasn't for me. And my friends were right and I was wrong. So I left teaching. And at that time, there was unbelievably poor employment prospects in the UK. There was high unemployment, particularly amongst 16 to 19-year-olds. So I combined two passions. One passion was with the environment and for the environment, and the other was working in an educational way with 16 to 19-year-olds. And I joined a startup scheme which was training young people to work in the environment. And I quickly realized, I joined because of my passion for the environment. I quickly learned that what was really important were the young people. As the scheme grew, I transferred what I thought was important to the adults who worked with the young people, and I started to train adults. So that was the beginning.
Right.
And I started, and it was tremendous fun because the UK government, as is often the case, hadn't got a clue what it was doing. It was throwing money at at this, and I had a lot of space to innovate. And I did some creative work with Bristol University's business school, and they offered me a job. And that was the beginning of my work in this field. And after a few years of working at the business school, I started my own consultancy with Harthill, eventually Harthill.
All right. So I wanted also to ask you, who has been, You have so much experience, 35 years with Harthill. I think we all can see the world is changing and the context for leadership is changing. And by leadership, I mean the same thing as you. It's not just for the people with a formal position. It's for everyone that want to influence and step up. But there are multiple trends, of course, impacting us in that space. So in the leadership arena, what type of leadership challenges do you see arising today that may not necessarily have been there when you started or even 10, 15 years back? How has the complexity increased for leadership?
I think that's such a good question, and I think it feeds in kind of enormously to the question of what needs to develop in people, in individuals. But let's move back a bit to your question, because I think there's a number of challenges which we're seeing in society, none of which, of course, will surprise you or anybody listening to this. I think the first one, of course, is the environmental challenge. We're seeing species loss at a rate that we've not seen before in modern times. We're seeing not just the loss of species, which is the visible sign, but a degradation of natural systems that threatens the place of us humans in the world. Some people would say that's not a bad thing, that maybe the world needs something terrible to happen to us humans. But I think if we could avoid that and find some better way of conducting our relationship with the natural world, that would be a good thing. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff in relationship to nature and our relationship to nature. And of course, we're seeing that as an enormous crisis at this time. So for me, that's that's clearly a really significant issue. I think the other issue is the one that's kind of emerging, and of course, it's not separate from that because it's to do with the size of the human population on this planet.
Yep.
But we are going to face consequences of climate change. We're going to see migration at levels we've not seen before. We're going to see pressures that we've never seen before, and we're going to have to find out how to work with that.
Yeah.
And the more we have a world that's unequal, and the world is unbelievably unequal, the more those pressures will be emphasized. So we've a social consequence that we need to be looking at. So I think that's a massive significance, and tied into that is this question of wealth distribution around the planet and within countries. And then I think finally, and something that I know so little about that I don't want to talk about it, but I think it's there on the horizon, which is that I think artificial intelligence is going to change the nature of what it means to be human at a certain point. And we shouldn't be ignoring it. I just feel unequipped to really explore that. But I think that's the fourth massive dimension. And these things are, if you take a leader in a corporate setting or in a non-governmental setting or in a governmental setting, those things are not issues for tomorrow. Those are issues for today.
Yeah.
And so the consequence of all of those is that for leaders in almost whatever role, their life actually is more complex because there are more dimensions to be thought about. The days, if you're working for a profit-making corporation, the days of being able to think only about profit, I think are, if they haven't gone, they're going. And clearly, around the world, the more responsible organizations are now starting to think about their place in the order of things. And that's important. But of course, that requires a certain kind of leadership. So those are, I think, are the challenges, and those are, I think, are some of the consequences that we might need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think that's a great kind of picture from the macro level. And I think also connected to what you're saying, that there are also these challenges that are more in people's face daily, with maybe more and more information to handle, more and more distractions, quicker change pace. And in the midst of that, you also have to deal with these massive, very complex questions that you brought to the table. So that's a very difficult cocktail to mix.
It is, Carl, absolutely. So I want to tell you about a leader that I worked with last year. I'll call him Gabriel, but he was director of tax for a large European corporation, worldwide corporation. And he said it was very interesting talking to him, because he talked about how his job has changed. And he said, in the old world, my main job was to keep all of the executives out of jail whilst paying as little tax as possible.
Yeah.
And if I could do both of those things, I did my job well. And he said, it's changed completely. Now I need to be in charge of a tax function that is visible across the world, that is fair and seen to be fair. I still need to not pay more tax than is right, but right is a judgment, is a part of this. And never before have I had so much external scrutiny. So he said, now I find myself talking to governments and NGOs about how much tax we should pay. So he's handling a completely different world, but he's still got the same job title.
Yeah.
Now, the skill set that's required to be successful in this job are completely different to the skill set and mindset that was required perhaps only 4 or 5 years ago. Now, I think that's fascinating. And for me, that's it couldn't be a more precise description of the kind of changes that people are having to deal with.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think those kinds of examples you see everywhere, both at the individual level, but also at organizational level. And, I think that if companies used to be outcompeted based on sort of an irrelevant product or an irrelevant service, and other competitors were innovating faster, I think in the near future, we'll see companies being outcompeted based on an irrelevant culture. Or an old-fashioned culture, and I think the companies that will succeed will be doing just what you said. They will be able to manage this ecosystem and find their place in that ecosystem, and it's much more of a stakeholder perspective rather than just maximizing shareholder returns. And does that make sense to you too?
Oh, completely. And so that's how you see the more progressive organizations working. So one of our clients, Danone, is regarding itself, and I don't think it's greenwashing. I think it's a genuine and sincere exploration to understand its place in the ecology of the planet and food. And so it's going right back to its relationship with the soil via farmers and all the way through the supply chain to customers. Now, of course, there's a massive amount of work to do, and one can look at them and be critical, but they're asking that question. And I think that's what organizations are increasingly going to have to do. And it's interesting because there, in that organization and organizations similar to them, the intention to be part of the broader ecosystem is very explicit. But in another client, and I won't name them, those individuals who are thinking in that way are having to operate kind of under the radar.
Right, in stealth mode.
They're saying, I'm doing this. It wouldn't necessarily be approved of yet, but I think it's the right thing to do. So those are the organizations and where we need to move from a kind of greenwashing approach to really taking on board the challenge and thinking about what that means for their leaders.
Right. And I think that requires a shift in leadership, and that brings us maybe to the core of this session today that I wanted to explore, which is the notion of vertical development. And you co-wrote an article in Harvard Business Review called "The 7 Transformations of Leadership" a number of years back, and I think it's a great article. And I think connected to these trends we now talk about, where complexity is higher than ever before, business leader needs to manage several perspectives at the same time. All of that require, in my view, also that we invest heavily in our own development, and that we grow as human beings to be able to hold that complexity that we're in. And that's where I think this notion of vertical development is really interesting. So could you share a little bit about what do we mean by that term, and how is it different to horizontal development?
Sure, I would love to, and thank you for introducing that. First of all, I'm in a bit of a bind because I really dislike this notion of vertical and horizontal, and yet we haven't found a better way of describing it. A better kind of phraseology. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is is the importance in this time of avoiding the binary. And here we are describing something as complex as development in binary terms.
Right.
However, that said, it's kind of quite useful to let's differentiate them and let's then merge them back again. So the idea of let's talk about horizontal development. So if, for example, I'm a cook, I can learn lots and lots of new recipes. I can learn all sorts of different recipes. I can amass different ways of cooking, and I may learn some new techniques along the way. As I do that, I am improving as a cook because I'm increasing my repertoire of dishes that I produce. However, I may still continue to cook with the same structuring, the same way of making sense of the dishes that I prepare. So I may be, for example, mainly interested in the taste and the aesthetic of it, and I'm not asking myself broader questions, ecological questions, for example, or questions about sustainability. So as I start to think about myself, the food I'm preparing, the people who eat this food, the place of it all in the web of being, I may start to see the cooking that I do through a different lens. So I may then start to bring different ways of engaging with the food into how I operate. So the differentiation there is between amassing different skills of a similar nature and seeing things differently, so that we can acquire different skills that we can utilize. So in a way, what I'm describing there is the difference between horizontal and vertical. So in leadership terms, we may, for example, learn to delegate. We may find different ways of delegating. That would be a horizontal development. And of course, very important, because delegation's a really important leadership skill. But once we start to think about power relationships, the impact of my delegating, what kind of decisions I'm making as I delegate, then I might start to think about myself, who I am and what I bring to leadership, the relative importance of the task in relationship with the task being an opportunity for somebody to learn and develop. So, for example, I might start to ask my question, not who would be best at this task, but who might learn most by doing this task. That would be a movement in my own awareness and consciousness. And so the idea of vertical is that we operate as human beings through our ability to see things, through our framing of reality. But we know that's not fixed. We know that young people Very young people, toddlers, frame their world in a particular way. And then it changes as they get bigger and as they get some experience, they start to see the world differently. So a 3-year-old sees the world differently to a 5-year-old, to an 8-year-old, to a 13-year-old. And there's a physical development going on, but there's also a change in the brain and the brain's capacity to make sense of things. Piaget, the psychologist, talked about this ability to see things differently as we get older. But from his perspective, we stopped developing in our mid-late teens, and then we got to this rational, deductive adult stage of development. Well, theorists since Piaget have built upon that and said, actually, that doesn't stop. As we move into adulthood, we continue the process of being able to see the world in different ways. And each successive way of seeing the world is a little more complex and a little more multifaceted than the perspective that came before. And that's the core theory. And it's not a theory that was kind of invented because that would be a great way of understanding development. It arose from noticing the differences between leaders, different leaders, and interrogating them as to what their journey had been, and understanding that in the early part of their life, they may have behaved, all of them consistently behaved in a particular way. But as they grew older, some of them started, through their experiences, to differentiate how they led. And what we started to realize is there are actually describable stages that we might move through as we grow older and wiser. The emphasis there being on might move through, because growing old doesn't mean that we'll grow wise.
No, I guess so. I always say that I think wisdom is a function of experience and reflection, very simplified. But I guess you can have a lot of experiences, but if you never stop and look at what happened and look at yourself and try to draw some conclusions or see the patterns, you may not necessarily be so much wiser, right?
Completely. And so the importance of reflection and experience in there is really, really important, isn't it?
It is.
I always joke with groups that the good news is that we can grow wiser as we get older. The bad news is that we just might not.
No, that's right. And I think what you just described to me, when I found out about this, I don't know how you call it, if it's a theory or a model or a framework or whatever it is, words are always,
I think, is the way we usually describe it.
It's more of a framework. I had a lot of aha moments, and particularly if I thought about myself, if I tried to step into the shoes of me when I was, let's say, 15 years old, how was I relating to myself, to the world around me, what was important, and then moving forward, I see myself graduating from university, my first job, and I could see that I was obviously relating to myself in a different way, and other things were important. And then, I could fast forward out into the future and see a couple of more of these, maybe I was 35 and now I'm almost 45. And there is something that has changed. And I think, to me, that's this vertical journey that we all have the potential to do. And I think most people do to some degree. But these stages
What would you say had changed the most, Carl?
Oh, in me?
What changed?
I think when I was, let's say, 15 or a little bit more than 15, let's say I was at high school, I remember for me it was very important to be right. I wanted the last word in any argument, and I wanted to be the best in whatever I was doing. I wanted to have, and I had a very difficult time taking a loss or criticism. And I had a worldview that people that didn't share, for instance, my political opinions were wrong, and I was right. So it was very black and white in that sense. And of course, then since you're asking, let's say I'm coming out of university, I'm having my first job as a management consultant, or it's not my first, but it's my first full-time that job that I have over time. I think I was very competitive. I wanted to be very successful. I was comparing to my peers. And I was running very fast towards various goals. And when I reached a goal, I set up a new goal, and then I continued running without reflecting so much on, is this the right goal for me? And why am I running like crazy for this goal? And of course, then I had a shift in my life where it was just too much running, and I had to stop and take some time to reflect. And that's where these new dimension came into my life. Who am I, and what's important to me, and what's unique with me? And of course, this is just continuing boiling in me in various ways, and I think I get more and more distance to myself, and although I can definitely fall back into my old patterns as well. But I have more patterns to work from, I think.
So that's a wonderful description of the movement that occurs, and there's it's what I want to say about that is that there's every single stage has its beauty and its purpose. So in the phase of your younger adult life where you were kind of what you said, you were running, you wanted to achieve things, you were competitive, you were pushing. It's fabulous because that's the point in life where we kind of we forge our mettle. We become, the work engine that we need to be, and it's a tremendously important stage of life that if we're not careful in this developmental framework, we kind of denigrate. So it's a very, very important stage of life. However, if that is still motivating you when you're 60, and the physical energy is diminishing, then it's going to create a problem for you. It's going to leave you in some sense hollow and empty. So the thing we learn about this is that different periods of life require different characteristics. So that's really important.
And would it make sense to share with our listeners the different sort of stages of development? And I know it could seem like a linear framework, but it's really not, because we are moving in and out of them, and there is a dynamic. But also, there seems to be a progression that you could potentially walk through. So, would you like? I mean, that could be a 3-day workshop in itself. But would it make sense to give an overview, just a few words about the different stages?
So. Yeah, I think so. But and thank you for kind of cautioning that it's. The way that I'll describe it sounds rather linear, and because that is the best way we found to describe it. But it's much more organic and fragmented and partial than I'm going to suggest. We've profiled nearly 11,000 leaders using the system that I'm going to describe, and there's an enormous agreement. People go, yeah, that describes me so well. So it seems that these stages do have some resonance with people's lived experience. So let's get on with it then. So as we leave our childhood, we're likely to experience ourselves in a stage which we've labeled diplomat. And the diplomat stage is all about wanting to belong. So I'll give you a really clear example of this. When my younger daughter was about 13, I had a terrible problem with her, getting her to school on time. And we had this conversation nearly every morning. She'd be putting her makeup on, and there'd be a really long process of putting her makeup on. And I'd say, come on, you need to get to school on time. And she'd go, Dad, you just don't understand. I've just got to get my makeup right. And right meant she had to look like all her friends, exactly like all her friends. And in her head, it was more important to look like her friends than to get into trouble for being late for school.
Right.
She had to fit in. And so, and there was nothing I could do or say that would change that, or her mother could do or say that would change that. When she got a bit older, she'd go, nah, I don't think I'll put my makeup on today. She had a different relationship to it because she didn't need to fit in the same way. So diplomat's all about fitting in. Unfortunately, we grow out of that. Not that there's anything wrong with fitting in, but if you're a leader and you need to fit in, it makes tough decisions hard. So what comes next developmentally is what we describe as the expert action logic. And here, fitting in is replaced with a passionate interest in the way things work. And the way things work becomes both a thing we learn, but more than that, a thing we adopt. So you caught it beautifully when you described that phase in your own life. You've got to get it right. And there's a right way to do something and a wrong way to do something.
Yeah.
And that, of course, the way that plays out is really, really helpful because it means people want to become incredibly knowledgeable in fields of knowledge and disciplines. So the technology that's enabling us to talk over this distance is enabled by countless thousands of people who have been fascinated by making technology work, both the computers and the software and the telephony and all the rest of it. So it's really, really important. And of course, you can imagine if you lead from a perspective that there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, and by the way that I do them is the right way, then you can start to see that in a complex world, that can have its problems from a leadership perspective. And so the next phase is described as achiever. And we have to be careful of the labels. These single words don't quite describe them, but in a way, the achiever label is the best because from the individual's perspective, it's about, I am what I do, I am what I deliver. And so this is very much about goals and targets, about things that can be created, about my impact in the world. And so any discipline, whether we're a manager or a doctor or a priest, all of those can have this achiever framework where we start to consider what we do in terms of outputs, outcomes, impact. Tremendously important, very, very valuable, and often a very, very kind of energetic phase. So often we associate this with kind of mid to late 20s all the way through to 40s or 50s. That's very, very typically that phase of life.
And isn't that phase also the phase that has, if you take a traditional company, not like very far back, because then you would go even further to earlier logics. But if you take a traditional company today, you see this logic a lot, right? In how it's set up and in its structures and how it's organized.
Well, we profiled one large American technology company, and we profiled some large group of senior managers, and we found that 85% of them profiled at this achiever action logic.
Yeah.
The company, interestingly, said, "Is this good news or bad news?" Actually,
and what did you respond?
Both.
Yeah.
And both because and it leads us into the next stages of development. By the way, we call these stages action logics. It's the kind of it's what informs our action, and it's good news because in an organization that's both about technical production and also about sales, then of course those achiever characteristics are really, really useful. The constraint is that achievers are likely to collaborate, to go along with the prevailing order of things and ask the question, how do I get the job done given this prevailing order of things?
Right.
And that can be dangerous. It can be really dangerous because history is littered with examples of people who just did the job they were told to do without questioning the context in which the job was done.
And especially today, I think when we talk about the trends, that the need for transformation for an organization to become something it's never been before, it's just getting bigger and bigger in many fields. And
I think that's right.
And of course, if your logic is that, okay, I'm super effective, I deliver on my targets, just tell me where to go and I'm going to run there very fast. That's very valuable, but what you're missing, I think you're also saying, is that you're not actually questioning, but is it the right target and is it the right system, given that the context has changed? Like, I think a lot of companies are in that space right now.
Absolutely, and Carl, the key word that you use there is questioning. So what happens? The developmental move to the next action logic, which we label individualist, and it's one of the probably the least satisfactory labels, because it's not about the selfishness of individualism. It's finding who I am.
Right.
It's got a question about who I am and where I stand. So it's more questioning, and it's questioning of myself, it's questioning of the system, it's questioning of relationships. And if, in a way, the certainty of the achiever becomes a space of uncertainty, of doubt and questioning. And for some people, that does represent a serious loss of something comfortable. And that's one of the dynamics, is that each time we move from one of these stages to the next, we lose something and gain something. But there is always a bit of a loss, something one has to give up. You know, you had to give up being right, you know, and accept that you might well be wrong. And of course, it's part of development. So the individualist starts to be more questioning. I'll never forget working for a large UK corporation. And there was the gathering of senior managers, and the chief executive, who I respected enormously, was on stage, and he was talking about the new direction for the company. And then he said something I regretted him saying. He said, you're going to have to decide whether you're on the bus or off the bus, whether you're on the pitch or off the pitch.
Yeah.
And what he was basically saying was, don't question us, just get on board with our direction.
Right.
And of course, I don't think that was helpful at all, because what he should have been doing was inviting intelligent contribution and modification of the direction. And that's what individualists will do in bucket loads. They'll comment on that. They'll start to see, to question, where are we going? Why are we going there? Why this time? And for some people, that is an absolute pain in the backside. It's not welcome. And so one of the things that happens for some people as they move into individualist is they get a rejection from the organization.
Right.
Now, I think that historically is very much the story. As organizations themselves are starting to develop, I think that kind of reaction to individualists is becoming, I think it's less strong. So I think there's more space for
and I think, I think it's so dangerous, especially in this time, if you have a culture where an individualist who's starting to question, why are we doing things the way we do them, and maybe see something that not everybody is seeing about the future and how we need to shift and transform to be relevant. When those kinds of people are met with, resistance, or they're too uncomfortable, or they're just questioning the order, and either pushed out or they themselves will sort of leave because it's not a nice environment to be in. It's such a loss for the company, because those particular people are the people that could sort of lead this organization into the future.
Completely right, Carl, completely right. So, organizations say we want people that think outside the box, and then they either sack them or they leave.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely spot on. So the next developmental action logic, the next developmental stage, is described as strategist. Again, watch the label. It's not about a job. It's about the way that you think. And we get rather fewer. So about 5% of people that we profile, 5 to 8% profile as strategists, although in some corporations, they're pretty rare, even less rare than 5%. So the interesting thing about strategist leaders, and we've done a lot of study of leaders who profile as strategist, is they're pulling together of all of the strands. So they're starting to think more than any other stage about a system dynamic. They realize a number of things. They realize, first of all, you can't see everything that's going on. So we don't know what's going on. We see bits of what's going on, but only bits of the system. So that informs the way they operate. There's a much greater connection between who they are inside and how they work outside. So there's a realization that how I lead is a manifestation of me. And so the work needs to be inside as well as outside, which is very important. There's a diminishing of a sense of ego, which is really important and very subtle. So the kind of sense of this sense of purpose, my engagement in the world beyond myself, is beginning to grow. It's a little counterbalanced because strategists can also have a rather inflated sense of, I can see the system. No one else can, but I can see it. So there's a little dance goes on there. But this question of, the strategist, these questions emerge at individualist, but at strategist, the question of what am I here to do? What's the purpose? What are the opportunities for me to spread beyond myself and to impact more widely than my own story is really significant. And that, tied to this increasingly systemic perspective, increasingly relational perspective, increasingly reflective way of working, creates quite a powerful way of understanding leadership. So strategist in organizational terms is perhaps the most powerful and significant of the ways of working, the mindsets, the action logics that inform this framework.
Yeah.
Now I'll just briefly mention there's development beyond, and in fact, one of the things I love about this framework is that it doesn't give us any limitation to the extent to which humans might develop. So here's a question for listeners at the moment. Just pause and imagine yourself for a moment. What's the outer limit of your development? What's the maximum, massive potential you have? What might that be as a generous human being, as a human being able and willing to interact with their family, with the world at large, with their organization? And this model says actually there's no limit to that. There's no limit to what we might be if we allow ourselves to grow and development. And I love that idea. I think it's a really important part of this. So the next and last action logic that I want to talk about is described, terrible label, as alchemist. And the notion of alchemist is that we start to let go of things. We start to see what emerges, to notice ourselves not so much as an agent of change, more as a servant, more as somebody here to help oil and grease the wheels, to move where movement is needed. It's probably more poetic. Some might say it's more spiritual. It's certainly deeply embedded in the notion of a system, more like an ecosystem. So small movements can have big impacts, and very few of us move into that later action logic. Probably one in 100. In the general population, maybe 1 in 500.
Yeah. But it's great to know that there is always the potential and that there is no end to the potential.
It's lovely, isn't it?
I like that.
Each of us to carry that question, who might I be? If I were to relax some of my fears, some of the things that hold me tightly,
yeah,
who might I be?
Yeah. But I think it's very cool. And I think this movement, if we look at the time we live in, we started talking a little bit about the trends, how everything is just getting faster and more complex. And we have some exponentiality in those trends. So it's actually hard to foresee where we'll be 10 years from now or 20 years from now, because there's so much exponentiality in that. And I think the brain, if we don't instruct it otherwise, is usually quite linear, which means that to navigate in the world as a human being and as a leader will require more and more of us. And and I think, I mean, this podcast, we call it Stigfinnare in Swedish, which means kind of pathfinder. And I think part of that is, at least in my own life, is exploring the boundaries of what's possible for me. And if you were to give some hints to the listeners, and of course this depends where you are in your development, but is there anything you can say in general, if you'd like to be a bit more conscious about your own development in this vertical sense, if we use that term? Yeah. What kind of practices could you explore?
Well, you started it off beautifully, Carl, by talking about the place of reflection. And so I think reflection's very important. If we're particularly in the grip of the achiever action logic, reflection's hard because we just want to get on and do more. So anything that enables us to reflect is really important. For those of us that find that difficult, we maybe need to write. We maybe need to journal. We maybe need to talk to our mobile phones and record ourselves. We may need to take ourselves off into nature. We may need to sit quietly, just simply sit. All of those, I think, are reflective practices. Some can be more disciplined than others. So I think that's a really significant starting place. I'd also really encourage what I call a stance of inquiry. So it's like, let's question as much of ourselves and what we take for granted as possible. So be curious, I think is really important, and particularly I think be curious about habits, the things that we do routinely, because they're often, those habits are sometimes extremely useful to us, but they are also a container. So if your habit is to always have coffee first thing in the morning, what would it be like not to? If your habit is always to shout when you get angry, what would it be like not to? If your habit is always to want to control the leadership meetings that you're leading and dominate them, what would it be like if you didn't? I think those are really important kind of questions about habits. And so it goes with that is experiment. Just do things differently. Do things differently, not for the hell of it, but to see what happens with a certain consciousness. And those can be little things, and those can be much bigger things. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing I'd encourage are two kind of facets of how we might be in the world, and one is be generous. So I think it's very interesting that by attending to kind of generously giving compliments to people, giving gifts to people, giving time to people, being aware of other people's struggles and work and appreciating them, I think that's deeply developmental. I think it's a really significant thing to do. And so if you as an individual have a tendency to be critical, and many of us have learned through our education to be critical as a way of improving things, right? And just kind of notice that, and look for generosity. And
I think also
I would say is,
sorry, I think critical. We can have the habit to be critical to others, peoples and their points of views, but also critical to ourselves, right?
Absolutely, and of course it plays an important part. But we can diminish what we have within us, what the possibility is by being overly critical. So beautiful that you point to that completely. And then I think just related to what we're talking about is being appreciative. So the very simple act of appreciating oneself, but appreciating the world around us, other people, I think is tremendously important. And I think this is a particularly useful practice because it requires a pause. It's like notice, pause, appreciate. And if we're in a hurry, we don't do any of those three. So I think it sounds a bit kind of weird that this might be a developmental practice, but I think it's a deeply developmental practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I was gonna come back to, we talked about organizations before and how they potentially could kind of make the life of a person that starts seeing the world a little bit differently, questioning things a little bit too much, and that would be a difficult space to be in. Do you see a development that organizations are more open to people that are seeing things differently and that are growing and developing beyond the achiever logic into individualist strategist? And do you also see organizations that actually consciously are cultivating a culture where this is actually encouraged?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're starting to see increasing numbers of organizations realizing that, first of all, their place in the ecosystem, and secondly, how they might therefore respond. So I do see organizations moving in that direction, and Frederick Laloux in his book talked about that and described those as teal organizations. And I think those, there are organizations like that. We clearly are at a point in history where we're kind of in a way between two worlds, or I hope we're between two worlds. I hope we're moving towards a different kind of world. But it's clear that the capitalist model is still strong. Organizations still have a mandate to maximize their returns to shareholders, and so that's a challenge. And many organizations still run on the basis solely of doing that. And so we need to have organizations with at least a triple bottom line, thinking about their impact on the world. And so there's all sorts of things happening that are really really useful in that domain, but we're seeing some organizations leading the way, but I wouldn't say we're seeing the majority of organizations yet following. And just to kind of put a note on this, we've just seen in 2020, at the end of 2020, we saw the Americans choosing not to re-elect somebody who was, I would say, operating from the opportunist action logic, which is, I know, for some of your, I don't know who's listening to this, but that they may not like that. But we've seen quite a challenge, and almost half of Americans chose to re-elect Trump. So. It's clear that we're not moving wholeheartedly towards this way of seeing the world. There are challenges.
Right.
I could talk about the British decision. I'm British, to leave the European Union, and what the kind of logic in action logic terms is behind that, when one starts to think about ecosystems. And relationships. So I think there's an optimistic future. I think the arc of the moral universe is long, and I think we're moving towards an ever better world. It is true that never before in history have so few people died violent deaths.
Right.
Never before in history have so few people died of starvation. Never before in history have so few people been enslaved. So, we may see some huge challenges in front of us. We've made some fantastic progress, but it's not going to be smooth sailing. I'm sure of that.
No, it's interesting because it's almost like there is this polarization of the world also if you use this framework. I mean, you mentioned the former American president who seemed to operate from a very early logic, and there are other politicians at the highest level in several countries that seem to operate from this kind of level. And on the other hand, you see people that seem to grasp the complexity of the totality and make interventions that are wise and empathic. And it's going to be, I sometimes say that I wouldn't want to live at any other time, because this time is so interesting and fascinating, but also the stakes are very high.
Yes.
And that's why we need as many people as possible, I think, to dare to step up and lead, and to dare to develop themselves, and to dare to break patterns, and to dare to be open and curious and empathic, and that's why I think this framework is interesting, because it seems that capacity will grow as you grow.
Yes,
I think yes, sorry.
Go on.
Please.
Go on.
No, I was just saying that for me, one of the biggest uses of this one has been to understand myself better, but the other has been to understand other people better, and to understand that I'm sometimes coming from a very different action logic, than a person or people that I'm speaking to, and trying to understand where they are coming from. Because sometimes, if one logic speaks to another, you're actually not really communicating, you're not really understanding each other. And I think that's part of what the world needs today, that we don't just put people in groups and out groups, but we're trying to meet and trying to understand, and even if we think very differently about things, initiate dialogue, and I think that can come from partly understanding that we seem to see the world, we're coming from different logics, we're seeing the world differently, and if I understand that, I can make a better decision in how to navigate that context.
I think you're absolutely right, and so this reduction in polarization, I think, is one of the most important themes in the world. I think that the more we move towards the later stages of this framework, the less likely we are to polarize. It's not that we won't. There's always a danger, but we're more likely to be able to go, we see this differently, but we need to see our humanity underneath it. And so that for me is one of the reasons why I've been so interested in this of the danger of polarization.
Right.
Including, of course, my own polarization. So that's something I have to watch very carefully.
Yeah. I mean, there is always the blind spots, right? But so, David, we've been speaking about this framework, and I wanted to ask you. You have a lot of life experience. You have a lot of experience in working with people and organizations. So, how do you yourself see your own purpose in life and what you're doing?
Well, I mean, it's a thing that changes, isn't it? So in this latter phase of my life, I've become very, very interested in the relationship between nature, between us human beings and nature, and nature and nature, as it were. And so I'm increasingly active in nature. I'm increasingly doing stuff out there in the world. I'm also increasingly thinking about what we can learn from natural systems. So
Yeah.
the last 20, 30, 40 years we've discovered so much about natural systems which we had no idea about. So along with the kind of absolute precipice that we've arrived at in terms of our natural world, we've also arrived with a whole bunch of understandings which we didn't have. We may use that. So I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in exploring in my work in the leadership context how that can be informed by the natural world and our relationship to the natural world. I'm particularly inspired by the way the natural world it's always letting us see systems. It's always letting us see system dynamics.
And it's also self-organizing, right? There is no boss making the decision.
Absolutely.
There is no really hierarchy in that sense.
Absolutely, and yet you can see the subtle importance of, you remove this one element from the system and the whole system changes.
Absolutely.
So, we are we hunted to extinction a little furry animal called a beaver from the UK, I think 400 years ago. We're now reintroducing them, and beavers cut down trees, and the trees make dams. And lo and behold, the dams prevent flooding because they hold back water.
Right.
So now these little furry animals are being used as part of a natural ecosystem to lessen the impact of increasing rainfall. Now, that's so interesting that subtle kind of interaction. And of course, we see that played out in many, many different ways. So when you start to think, I'm living and working in this organization, what's the ecosystem of the organization, and what part do I play in it, and what might change?
Yeah,
that's when we start to get some very kind of interesting explorations.
and I think that's where we need new metaphors, right? Because the traditional metaphor of an organization is a machine. It's not an ecosystem, right? And if you have a machine metaphor, you would be looking at other things. But if you shift that metaphor of your organization into a living ecosystem, which is dynamic, which is somewhat unpredictable, that's a different field to work in.
That's beautiful. That's so absolutely. And then we start to work with the idea not so much of control, because we can't control an ecosystem, but of working with the energies of the system, and that's a very different approach.
It is.
It requires curiosity. It requires observation and reflection. All of those things.
Yeah. So another personal question, if that's okay, and I'm curious also, since you have been working professionally with this so long, but if you look at yourself as a person, what part of your life, either kind of intentionally created or just something that happened to you, has been most developmental, would you say, helping you grow and access maybe later logics?
Well, I think there's when we think about how do we develop, there's the long, slow burn of learning, of experience.
Right.
So, running my own small consultancy company, engaging with huge corporations, meeting really interesting people. That's been a lifetime journey, which has in itself been developmental. And, I've paused to reflect. I've been and done all sorts of workshops. I've read, I've watched films, I've written. So all of that is really, really important to the developmental journey. I've had a couple of children. I've had 2 girls who are up and out in the world now. And, that's a deeply, deeply developmental journey if you do it with awareness and consciousness. And I learned so much along the way that continually I look back and wished I'd learned that ahead of my experience with them rather than retrospect.
Yeah, I recognize that.
Although I'm very, very proud of my girls out in the world. So those would be those are kind of slower burn things. I think things come along that challenge us that we don't want. So I'd say I had a very comfortable and fortunate life, but in my kind of early mid 50s, I had a divorce that I didn't want. It impacted the children. It impacted me deeply. I absolutely didn't want that divorce. And looking back now, more than a decade later, it was one of the most developmental experiences of my life. And in a way, I don't think I would have made the next developmental move if I hadn't have had that unwanted challenge.
Right.
So I think there's always something in life, whether it's an illness or a loss of somebody you love or a redundancy or a divorce, a thing comes along that we really didn't expect, we certainly didn't want. And yet, if we can engage in it with curiosity and reflection and an openness to learn, which of course I can't say I had at the time.
No.
It's how we develop that. Then those life challenges are really important. So I think absolutely I would point to that, and I would say that's kind of the biggest unwanted challenge of my life.
Yeah.
Are really significant.
Yeah. And I think sorry.
The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is kind of freedom, and this is something that I notice quite a lot with the people I work with in large organisations, which is there's often a moment when you suddenly realise that you're had by something, had by the need to succeed, had by the need to reach a certain level, to earn a certain income, had by the need to secure your future. And at the moment you can really truly let go of those things and still be passionate about the work you do, you're free to act in a different way. And so I noticed at a certain point in my career, I felt free of a need to be anything in particular, and much more relaxed about emerging into a space. Yeah. And that was a huge developmental experience for me. And I don't think that everybody has that experience, but I'd really encourage people to look for it.
Yeah. And I guess that could be a relief, right? That you suddenly experience that you have more freedom to be or to choose paths or to do things than you may think.
Absolutely. And I notice, I mean, in the long history I've had of working in organizations, I've seen people make that transition and notice the difference in their leadership. I've met people who have been the other side of that transition before I've met them, and just noticed how much more impact they have on their organization and their ability to move with greater flexibility. So I think it's, you asked earlier on about what's our developmental practice, and perhaps one of the practices is an inquiry into what am I not free of, and how could I be freer? It's a difficult question, but
yeah, and because it's a question about seeing what you don't see. I mean, initially, you could potentially, obviously, see more than you see today. But I like what you say, because I think the way to do that is to ask the right question. If you ask yourself the right question, just as the one you just posed, you suddenly may see something new that you were not seeing a minute ago.
Absolutely.
And I think that's also one of the ways, I think, to access maybe later logics. Maybe you will not develop. I mean, this is, as you say, this is a gradual progression potentially that could take many, many years to shift between one logic to another as your center of gravity. But you could, would you say that you could sort of shortcut it a little bit, that from time to time in the right context where it's important to maybe, challenge the system you're in, for instance, you could, through the right questions, direct yourself or your team or your organization to see something that you actually didn't see before, and you wouldn't have seen it if you just progressed habitually.
I think that's right. I think it's very hard to shortcut our development. We develop through experience and reflection on experience, and then internalizing. I think it is a lifetime's journey. But I've said for years, take your development seriously. Don't, for goodness sake, take yourself too seriously. But take the possibility of your development seriously.
Yeah.
And so, we don't have to be as we are. It feels as though we do, but actually we've all sorts of flexibility. And so, think about that. And so think about how you use your time. For example, TV is a great place to kind of switch off and relax. But if you spend an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours of an evening just watching game shows or whatever, what else could you be doing? You've only got one life. So I think there's a kind of consciousness there. If you spend your time worrying yourself to death, could you be less worried? Those are the kind of questions that I think can accelerate our development. And then do expose yourself to unusual things. Go on wacky courses, meet different people. I forget who it was, but said, every now and then invite somebody dangerous to dinner. In these COVID
wonderful.
times, I'd like to invite anybody to dinner.
Yeah, absolutely. We have these virtual dinners, but thanks for sharing all that, David. And I think another thing that you could do, I guess, just to our listeners, if you're interested in, you could actually take also this profile, because you have a profile tool based on this developmental framework. Would you like to say a couple of words about that and what you sort of could get out of it?
If you're interested in finding out which action logic you work from, if you look at the Harthill, www.harthill.co.uk website, you can find out how to profile. You could also read the 7 Transformations of Leadership article that was published by Harvard, which you mentioned, Carl, earlier on.
And we put it in the notes. We put a link in the notes to this session.
So that's also, you can kind of interrogate yourself and ask where do I think I'm coming from? So that's another way of doing it.
Yeah, true. And also, you could, the listeners could contact us here, the Leader Evolve community. We partner with you, and it's the same tool that we could debrief.
Absolutely, and if you're working in Swedish particularly, that's just the place to go. Yeah.
But I must say, to me, it's been very helpful to get that profile. It confirmed maybe a few things that I thought, but it also gave me a number of new angles on myself. And maybe one last thing that we could touch upon here in this, connected to those logics, because that's what I learned, that the notion of hooks. I learned that I had some hooks. Could you explain the term hooks and how it could show up in life?
Yeah, we talked. You earlier on very helpfully said it's not exactly linear, and so we've the metaphor we often use, hooks, or imagine yourself to be a piece of seaweed floating in the tide. Well, if that's seaweed and it's moving along as a body, we're developing in this direction, and then suddenly a little bit of it gets hooked. So it's only a little bit of it gets hooked, but it gets caught. It gets caught on a rock or left behind fishing hook or something like that. And then that piece of seaweed stops moving because one little bit of it is hooked, and it starts to spread out over a range of action logics, ways of seeing the world, but part of it's hooked. So the question is, and we all get a bit hooked, so what do we get hooked by? Is it money? Is it sex? Is it status? What is it that hooks us? Is it being right all the time? What is it? What is it that hooks us?
And when is it? I think to me, it's definitely under pressure or when I'm stressed. These hooks are hooking me much more clearly than when I'm in a more relaxed space.
Absolutely. So these are the little grab points. I often like to distinguish between, and this is the work of Keegan, between having and being had by.
Yeah.
So I can, for example, I can be so angry that I'm had by the anger, and you know that there's a phrase in English: I was beside myself with anger.
Right.
But sometimes things happen that genuinely make us angry, and we have the anger. And quite rightly, because something's happened that we are absolutely, it's appropriate to be angry. So having and had by are two different things. So if you take money, I may have a relationship to money where, I'm concerned to look after my family and to have enough in reserve. So I have a relationship with money. But if I can never have enough, if I can never get enough in the bank, then it has me. And if I can't make any decisions about my life that aren't about optimizing my income, I am truly had by it. So that's the thing we need to be working with. And life, I think, is a succession of changing what we're had by into what we have. And whether that's our relationship to chocolate or wine or coffee or whatever, we're forever moving through those hads and had by. And the more we can know about that, the better.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the freedom, right? It creates freedom.
Completely, it's another freedom. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we're gonna start to wrap up. I think this is super interesting, and as I said in the notes to this pod, we'll put some links to things you could read, or if you want to make the profile. Is there anything else you'd like to end by saying to our listeners? I think the idea is, of course, that we're a community of pathfinders and trying to find, maybe sometimes at least, our own path and to see patterns that may be limiting us. I think it requires some courage. It requires some clarity. Do you have any last, you shared a lot already, but any last piece of thought or advice to us listening?
Well, I think you're keying up the thing that I think's important is this question of community and who your community is, and making sure that part of your community is developmental. So the notion of deliberately developmental conversations and being in place with people where you can talk in a very honest and sincere way about yourself, what you're doing, your development, your challenges. We all should have at least one place like that. And ideally, our primary relationship should support that, but we should also have something like that outside of our primary relationship. So I'd really encourage everybody to not only think about how they can develop themselves, but how they can be in a developmental community. That's probably the last note that I would make.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think that's really, really important. And I think that's something we're trying to create both with the podcast and with the Leader Evolve programs, so people can connect and expose themselves to other people that also want to develop. I think that's key. So one thing that stuck with me, I think there's many things that are really worth pondering from this conversation, but I think you said it so beautifully that we should take our own development seriously, but we shouldn't take ourselves seriously. I think that's beautiful. And that distinction between our own development and our own selves and our egos. So thank you for saying that. And I think what we've been talking about now, if you're new to this, if you haven't heard about this, at least that's my experience. Sometimes when I share this with people, it's a little bit hard to grasp everything. So, but if you think there is a seed in this that could be interesting, I really encourage you as a listener to read on, because to me, this has been so helpful to make sense of myself and to make sense of the people around me, try to at least, and to make sense of the world, and maybe to try to navigate a little bit more skillfully. And I think that's just going to be more and more critical for leaders as we go on, connecting to the trends we talked about earlier on. So, well, thank you so much, David, for being on the podcast and taking the time. And I hope to see you in Sweden at some point again.
I hope to come to Sweden very, very soon as we're allowed. But thank you for creating this series and for inviting me to talk. I feel very grateful to you.
Thank you. It's a very big pleasure. So take care and thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.